Good evening, and thank you again for joining us this evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Stacy Mullaney, and I'm the Chief Fiduciary Officer at Fiduciary Trust. We are privileged to work with many of you on matters involving investments and wealth planning and financial planning, but as Austin already noted, we think that much of what we really do is act as a counselor on life's journey. And I think our topic tonight on elder care is a good example of that. Elder care touches everybody at some point, either planning for themselves or planning for family members. And so we thought it was important to bring a panel of experts here tonight, both from within and beyond our firm, to talk more about this important issue and to help guide all of you, perhaps, in decisions you may be making at some point, currently or in the future. So, Bob, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stacy. We thought we'd start off with a question for the audience. We're not going to put you on the spot throughout the whole presentation, so don't worry. But just a show of hands, how many people in the room are aging? Obviously, it's a topic that is important to all of us. And the reality is that demographic trends, and we're all aware of them, are resulting in a situation where the amount of time, the amount of years that we're likely to have as an elder are expanding. The first slide, and you have the slides at your table as well, the first slide shows the trend over the 100 years from 1915 to 2015 of the life expectancy of someone who's attained age 65. And you can see how, and it's broken out by gender, female and male, and you can see that for a female now, in 2015 at least, a person reaching age 65 had a life expectancy of almost 86, just under 86 years of age, whereas a male is creeping up as well, is just about 83. And the other interesting thing about this slide is you can see that the females, the slope is fairly smooth over the 100-year period, an increasing slope, where the males seem to sort of just go along for the first 50 years of that period, and then in the second 50 years, there's a much steeper increase. And so the bottom line is that the elder years, there are more of them for most of us. We have the next slide looks at people who are over 100 years old, and the projections indicate that for every centenarian today, by 2050, there will be 15 centenarians. That's just a huge increase. Our underlying theme in this talk is really that with thoughtful planning around the issues that we're going to be discussing, you can increase the odds that these additional years, if you have them and are fortunate enough to have them, are indeed a gift and are not a burden. And that's what we hope to accomplish with the discussion today. I have one more question for the audience, and this doesn't require a show of hands, but just to think about it, and that is, what do you do for fun? There was an article in the Wall Street Journal on this subject earlier this month, and I would say that if thinking about that question, if you don't have a ready response, you really need to think about, well, maybe I should do some lifestyle adjusting. The article talked about the fact that when adults are approaching their retirement years, they've had their nose to the grindstone. They've been working on their careers. They've been raising and educating their children, paying for college, saving for retirement, maybe helping assist their elderly parents. And by the time they get to that retirement stage, they've forgotten how to have fun. And it's an adjustment. And the article talks about that and the fact, and Kate's going to go into this a little bit more, that having fun, in addition to being fun, is good for us. It's very good for us. And this applies not only in the first stages of retirement, but in the later stages as well. The article talks about some experts in fun, and there are such things as some experts in fun. And one person who's profiled, who I think we should look to as we talk, keep in mind as a role model, was a former business owner named Ray Jacobs. And Ray plays pickleball, he bowls, he skis during the winter months. And in reaction to the concept of an expert in fun, his reaction was, I don't need an expert in fun, I am one. That's all I do is have fun. So I think if we think of Ray as a role model, And that's an important overlay to the more serious topics that we'll be talking about now. The first segment, we're going to talk about considerations around where do I live in my elder years. And Kate's going to start with that and address the question, basically, what are the key questions people should be asking themselves when determining where they should live in the different stages of retirement?
Sure, thanks. And so happy to be here talking about these really important topics, and love to have people planning ahead and having these conversations, and you'll see a theme there in my comments. First things that we really encourage people to think about is, where do you want to be geographically? That can help you hone in on your first sort of point to decide as you begin to look at the options. You know, do you want to live near family where they're located? And that would be important to think about. Do you want to live in a city or in an area where you can walk when driving is no longer easy or possible? Do you want to live in different areas at different seasons? And that's something to be considered. And if you think about and there's many more questions, but geographically think about, where's the first? Is it my medical providers or the hospital system that I'm most attached to? So thinking about those considerations first will help you to hone in on what that first point is for you to think about. And remembering that not all areas are created equal. So sometimes when you get to the area and then you start thinking about these other points, you may need to renegotiate that. Because different parts of the country and different areas offer different more or less opportunities. The second really is, what's important to us as we age, along with the fun factor, which is obviously really important. We'll talk a little more about that later. But what's important? Is it living, again, in an area that is near family? Is it living in your own home for the rest of your life and staying in that community where you grew up or where you raised your family? Is it living in an effortless environment where there is no work, where there is no issues related to taking care of the home and all of those things? So really thinking about those kinds of questions. What kinds of things will be important to socialization, multi-generation communities versus a community with your peers? So there's many considerations, but begin to hone in on what those goals are and what are the important factors that will help you to narrow your choices. Remembering that if you get to narrowing those two choices and those don't really result in a lot of things that are attractive to you, being prepared to adjust that. I think just really thinking about the questions about, for instance, staying in your home, taking that a step, doing a little deeper dive. A lot of people, for instance, say, I want to be in my home for the rest of my life. And then they begin to think about what that home would look like if they had to adapt for mobility issues, bring in help for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And those kinds of things start changing your perspective of, maybe that home isn't exactly what I'm looking for. So there is no right or wrong answer. It really is just about thinking about those considerations. The other thing that's really important is this discussion often sparks conversation between you and your spouse or your partner and your family. You'd be surprised how many people really are not on the same page, and they thought they were. You've got spouses that come into our office for a consultation for the first time, and in front of me, they're having this discussion about, I thought we were going to, and fill in the blank. So it really does give you the opportunity to begin thinking through that and lining up the possibilities.
What resources are available to help people make these decisions?
Sure, and a great question, and there are many, but for this short of a discussion, we'll talk about a few. First, I think before we talk about physical resources, and you see a few logos there, certainly not an endless list, but finding a partner in the process, looking for people who are neutral resources with information that can assist you to explore and plan and begin to make some plans around your goals and your interests. And weighing the pros and cons of the implications of these choices is very important. And then using trusted advisors to help you check your thinking and do a little fact-checking with you. Involving family when it's appropriate. You know your family. Sometimes that's a good idea, and sometimes it's not. So I'll leave that to you. And relying on unbiased resources is really important. And here you have a number that are, the internet is an amazing thing. It can be dangerous. We call it the Google curse occasionally because you can know enough just to get dangerous with that information. But you want unbiased reports and information, facts, studies, and research that will help guide you. A life care manager, you see one of the logos there is an Aging Life Care Association. There's a resource that is becoming more known, and it's what we do in our practice. And these are a group of people who are unbiased, and they're there to work for you as the client. And in some cases, when you get stuck in the decision process or vetting resources, or you have family conflict or difficult, conversations that aren't coming easily, hiring an unbiased consultant like an Aging Life Care manager can help you with that. And that's something that can be very helpful in the future. All right, and lastly, just one more slide, because although we're talking about great planning, I don't know about you, but I don't have a crystal ball. I hope I'm not disappointing you here tonight. That wasn't part of the promise, I hope. But no matter what plan you make and whatever decisions you decide on together as a family or as a couple or as an individual, with all of those advisors, it's really important to remember that life changes. And so the best laid plans can often change to unexpected events, and they can change that trajectory or that plan. And it might be something as simple as the desired location. Where you were moving to be near your son or daughter, now they've relocated across the country. So they're no longer in that location, and that's not a viable option. Thinking about health status. We have many folks who are looking at communities like a continuing care retirement community, and they're looking at and weighed all the pros and cons and have put their deposit down, but there's a 5-year waiting list. And all of a sudden, one or the other of them has a health crisis, and it changes their ability to go in in the same way to that community. So those kinds of things can happen, but having those advisors and that team that you've established, hopefully, with financial and legal and social advice and guidance, you can often really still meet those goals and just adjust the plan. And I think the key is to really remember being an informed consumer and really nailing those goals, and being flexible enough, but really understanding them so that you can head in that direction. And then you have that as your peace of mind, and you have that as your fallback, so that these years aren't just quantity, but quality.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We're now going to switch to the subject of financial planning, something that we spend a lot of time working on with our clients. And Jody, I think the first question there is, what are some of the key, in retirement planning, some of the key factors that people tend to underestimate?
Great, thanks, Bob. I think there's 4 factors I kind of want to highlight this evening. The first being inflation. We've kind of recently been in fairly low inflation period when you look at the economy. That may or may not continue indefinitely, and it's likely it will not. And I think one of the things people need to remember when you are thinking, living out the longevity that we're talking about, that inflation can be a real factor. With the rule of 72, even a 3% inflation rate means that your costs will double in 24 years. And so looking at the chart, the next slide here, it indicates that, a couple at age 65, there's a 50% chance they're going to live to age 92. Well, guess that's more than that 24 years, right? That would have doubled at only a 3% inflation rate. So 50% that one of them will live to age 92. It's 30% chance that one of them will live to age 96. And that means a third of the couples need to be planning beyond age 96. So one of the things I often hear from people is, that second factor, how long am I going to live? I don't need to plan that long. In reality, you probably do, because you don't know, what's going to change in healthcare, how your health is going to play out. And so I always encourage people to plan longer than they think. The end of the plan should not be a plan to die, but we want to plan to live, right? And so with that, you need to take that into account. And 10% of couples will have someone living to age 100. And the statistic Bob mentioned earlier, if you think about that a little bit, that for every 1 centenarian alive today, in 2050 we expect there to be 15. So a lot more people are going to need to be planning for a lot longer. So that second factor again is longevity. And your expenses may change during that period, but they won't necessarily decrease, especially if you're in need of additional care, which we'll get into that in a moment. But the third factor people need to think about is medical costs. That'd be medical insurance as well as medical costs, just the co-insurance or the additional amounts you'll be spending. When we look at the costs of Medicare, it starts at about $134 per month per person. But if you're a high-income person, with a modified adjusted gross income of $160,000 or more, or $320,000 more for a couple, it jumps all the way from $134 per person per month to $428 per person per month. And there's a sliding scale in between, like the $85,000 income number on up to that higher number, but it accelerates pretty quickly. So those costs can be fairly significant. And the other thing that happens, those numbers don't include the prescription drug coverage. They don't include the Medigap policy that you may choose to have. And prescription drug coverage actually has an addition to it too, based on income potentially. And the costs, when you look at how the numbers work out, the costs really accelerate when you are looking at between age 65 and age 85. There's a big difference in the cost of medical care for a person age 65 and a person age 85. So that's one of those costs that we always use an inflation rate well beyond kind of the standard 3% and talk about 5.5% or 6% for that. And we also talk about higher costs when you talk about long-term care. And the next slide kind of illustrates some of the costs associated with that. When you age, there's a good chance you're going to need some help. And maybe the usual first help with that is going to be, a family member, maybe a spouse, maybe a child, a family caregiver, that will come in and just, help to do some cleaning or take you to the grocery store, and eventually sometimes that may increase as far as the needs go. But you also need to think about the cost to that person, both an emotional toll that can be taken with this additional stress there, as well as if they're spending more time caring for you or a loved one, they're probably spending less time in the workforce, and that can have a long-term effect on their financial resources as they think about how they're going to take care of themselves as they're going to be pushing that 100 mark, if you will. And that becomes very important. So thinking about the emotional and the financial toll on family members as they help out. So one thing some people use to help with that a little bit is adult daycare. And so adult daycare can be a great resource. In the Boston area, it averages about $69 per day, which translates to about $17,000 a year, as the slide shows. Home care is more expensive. Boston's kind of $21 to $30 per hour, averages about $26. That means if you have 8 hours of care per day, you're going to be spending about $76,000 a year. So you think, I may need that eventually 24-hour care. And that's going to put you close to $225,000. So it goes up very quickly, and that's not full-time medical care, by the way. That's kind of assistance in the home. There may be some medical piece of that, but not complete. And so some people will, again, they were thinking about living at home, but when they kind of go to plan B because of finances. And so they may turn to assisted living, which is a little bit cheaper, about $72,000 a year, $6,000 per month on average for the first family member. Or, if you do need full-time, round-the-clock nursing-style care, a nursing home in the Boston area is close to $150,000 a year. So all of those costs can be pretty significant, Bob.
It's a daunting list of costs, and for any of us to contemplate, what are some of the options for meeting that challenge, like the funding options?
Yeah, funding options are very important, obviously, to try to meet that. So a lot of people think, I'm going to use Medicare for long-term care. Guess what? That's probably not your best plan, because Medicare only provides up to 100 days of long-term care, with the caveat that you've had to spend 3 days in the hospital before that. And then there's some kind of, you need to make progress along the way to get the whole 100 days of care anyway. So that's not the best plan for long-term care. So some people are like, I'll think about Medicaid or Mass Health. And that is a great resource for certain families. There's very limited resources that are allowed if you're going to go on Medicaid. There's a 5-year look back, so advanced planning is really, really important with that. And it's not for most of our clients, and quite honestly, because of the resources they have. And that's the good news. But it is there as a safety net for those that need that. Some of our clients have long-term care insurance and use that as a resource, which can be terrific. It can be hard to get. It can be expensive to maintain. Insurance companies do increase the premiums on that occasionally, and so that can be a little surprising and something to pay attention to. Something to think about with that is inflation, and make sure you have an inflation rider, because as I talked about before with that longevity risk, what you think is a good long-term policy without good inflation riders on that won't be as impactful as you think later on. But the thing to know about long-term care insurance is you're going to have to either have severe cognitive impairment, or you're going to have to be unable to conduct at least two out of the 6 activities of daily listing, which are listed on the slide. So it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to be one of those things where you're probably going to need help and support in some forms of care before you get to the point you would trigger a policy. And so you really do need to make sure you've got some personal and trust assets set aside to take care of you in your retirement, and look at the income resources you may have. And one of the things I always caution people on is try not to spend too high of a percentage of your personal assets too early in your retirement, because if you are spending too high of a percentage, you're going to end up with problems later on and being able to maintain that lifestyle, especially as inflation kicks in and costs change and needs change. So just something to pay attention to there is to keep that spending level in the moderation to give yourself more flexibility later.
Thanks, Jody. Now we're going to transition to estate planning and legal considerations with Harry. And Harry, I guess the first question is, what are the risks that you try to protect your clients from as they approach their elder years?
Well, Jody's just been talking about some of them, and one of them is longevity, that you live out your assets, and hopefully that won't apply to anybody in this room. And the other is, of course, long-term care and long-term care costs. But I want to focus more on what can happen if you lose some cognitive ability and become perhaps a little more isolated as you get older and friends die, people move to other parts of the country. And people can really become victims of scammers and other people trying to commit some kind of financial exploitation. And how many of you have either gotten a call that the IRS is about to come and arrest you, or an email that a grandchild is off in Europe and needs money, or else they're going to be on the street? There are all sorts of scams going on now, and like the banks, the reason they're focusing on people who are older, because people who are older may beginning to have some kind of cognitive decline, and I've read that the ability to manage money is kind of one of the first things that goes. And second, it's where the money is. I mean, people who are older have been working their whole lives, have accumulated some money. So as you get older, you're more likely to be a target, and you're more likely to be vulnerable to a target. Also, family members. We talked, Kate mentioned that she's not going to talk about anyone's individual family members, but some are helpful, and sometimes they're not as helpful, and they confuse whose money is whose. And especially as they become caregivers, and something Jody talked about was family members who provide care, often do so at great sacrifice, without a clear conversation often about how they'll be compensated. And the result can be that they feel they need to be compensated from the parents' money, and they do it under the table, which and then fairness becomes in the eye of the beholder, the child providing the care and the other children who aren't, can create real problems. And then finally, other caregivers who are in the house taking care of someone who's older and probably feeble, maybe isolated. It gives them, there can be created a real intimacy, real access to information, real access to funds, and they can, the elder can become victimized as a result. So those are really the risks that are out there for all of us as we become older.
And the obvious next question is, what are some of the solutions to address those risks?
I'm glad you asked that question.
Good. We practiced before.
So the first thing is really doing some of the things which I'm sure just about everybody in this room has done, which is basic estate planning. Power of attorney, healthcare proxy, HIPAA release, and a revocable trust, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute, but also transparency. to make sure that other people know what's going on and what your situation is, and steps to reduce isolation. So, so I went through quickly the estate planning documents, but we go a couple slides ahead, I guess, on revocable trusts. While powers of attorney and healthcare proxies are really important because they name agents to represent you and step into your shoes if you become disabled, I become very much a proponent of revocable trusts, and there are a few reasons. One is there are a lot of banks and investment houses that don't accept powers of attorney despite the fact that the law says that they have to. And you end up spending a lot of time and a lot of energy convincing them that a power of attorney is valid. With a revocable trust, you can have a co-trustee who's already on the trust. And whether they're active while you're healthy or they're just ready to step in when need be, when they have to, they have access to the accounts, they can see what's going on, and if need be, they can step in immediately. And whether that's a family member, co-trustee, or fiduciary trust as co-trustee, is, I think, the best solution for financial exploitation. But the other part of this, one big part of using a revocable trust is transparency. And I think, because whoever the co-trustee is can know what's happening and has the ability to step in, as I said, but transparency can go a lot further beyond that. I think the more everybody who's involved, all family members, know what's going on with your finances, with your plans, with your wishes, and that they work together and talk to each other if they have to, the better off you're going to be and the more likely you're going to avoid anybody taking advantage of you. And if something does start going south, people will be able to step in relatively quickly. So related to that is avoiding isolation. And that's, so again, make sure everybody's involved, stay involved. I think Kate's going to talk about some of that in activities so that you're outside of the house and dealing with other people. And then if that stops happening, people find out. And think about where you're living. Kate talked about geographically where you're living, but also if you're home alone in a house down a long country road, like the drive we took to get here, it's beautiful, but it may be hard for people to know what's going on. And if you have a caregiver in that isolated house, they're probably more likely to be able to take advantage of you. So avoid isolation and make plans now to avoid isolation when the time comes. And I think that's one of the best, what they say, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I think as Kate said, to conclude, we don't know what's coming. So we can make the best plans we can, but if you have the basic estate planning documents in place and have people that you trust, including family members, attorney, accountant, financial planners, and trust officers working with you, that's really the best plan you can put in place so you can adjust to whatever happens.
Thanks, Harry. Now we're going to circle back to Roy Jacobs and the idea of fun. We're going to talk a little bit about wellness. And Kate, what are some of the strategies for maintaining more healthy physical and mentally sharpness and just condition in our elder years?
Well, wellness and all the idea of aging and aging well is getting a lot of attention. And there's a lot of research and studies out there that you can find to really give you some of this information more in depth. For today's purposes, in the short conversation, I'll highlight 4 that I think are important to think about. First, I'll tell you the quote at the top, slightly different. There's a gentleman who is the founder and CEO of a company called Boulder Broadcasting. His name's Mark Middleton, and you can follow him on Facebook, and you can find this. It's fascinating. It's called Growing Boulder. And we saw him speak recently at a national conference, and his quote was, his slide actually was a sticky note on the fridge, let's say, right? And it said, "Note to self, you are not too old and it's not too late." And I think that's a really important thing to think about as we start talking about this whole concept of wellness. I think it's important to remember that, the idea of rebranding aging, we have all these extra years that we've just talked about. We've identified ways to keep our finances in check and ways to keep us legally, sound so that the decisions and the process is leading us well. But what we're not talking about, and what I hope to share a little bit, is really this idea of, so we've got all of that set up, now what? How do we have fun? How do we stay well? How do these years look quality, not just quantity? So there are really 4 items here, and you'll see them on the slide. Engagement and purpose is the first one. Simply put, and Harry touched on it, and the reason why it's, we're all talking about it is more and more research is showing this, that loneliness and isolation are actually more detrimental. A new study just, was beginning discussions around this, more detrimental than smoking. Right? But I will tell you, that is the concept of loneliness and isolation has so many impacts and so much sort of the trickle-down effect of that, some of which is what Harry talked about, is really being victim and being taken advantage of. But we also know that there are issues related to, not feeling as though you have a purpose any longer, not being connected. Being lonely. It's interesting also, the concept of being lonely and being alone are 2 different things. So even though you bring in help 24 hours a day in your home, you can still feel lonely. So it's really important to separate those and think about how would you solve for that. And many people, and a lot of the information is really looking at mentoring and looking at ways to join groups and lifelong learning, just staying engaged. And that is really something. Find what's important to you, find your passion, and then follow it. And if you can't do it the same way you always did it, adapt. Don't stop. So that's one. The second is movement, and the studies around movement and exercise is unbelievable right now. And the more that they look at this, the more they find that it really has a clear impact on your ability to fight chronic illnesses, which leads to those kinds of declines, and then also looks at things like managing dementia and decline and Alzheimer's in cognitive ways. So movement and moving, keeping blood flow through your brain. I think 30 minutes of activity, 3 to 5 days a week is really what they're prescribing. We're not talking about running marathons, although, that certainly is one of them.
We can do that.
You may want to do that.
Bob can
Go
do that.
on the
Bob can do
website and look at the Growing Bolder videos. These are phenomenal things. It's not all exercise, but there's a lot of people who are really getting outside the box in terms of what they're doing. And then, one of the quotes I like is, if Sudoku is a shovel, exercise is a bulldozer. So really think, everybody's doing their Sudoku every day. Well, get out and move, because exercise is actually being shown to be more impactful. So, and you don't have to go to a gym to do that, by the way. It's walking, it's dancing, it's anything. It's yoga. Movement comes in many forms. Lifestyle, the other one of the other squares here really talks about lifestyle and healthy eating. We've all heard it, but the Mediterranean diet is really there's diets that are really prescribing some real impact on aging. So looking at that, I'm not selling the Mediterranean diet only. I'm just using as an example. But activity, again, your lifestyle, trying to learn something new, challenging your brain. Take a new route home. Anything you're doing to engage those connections in your brain. One of the last square there is really another term that I just loved from this conference, and it's called, the statement is prehab. And what I really like about that is, you can do it now or you can do it later. Later it's called rehab. Because, and so if there's really, and we talked about the financial impact, we talked about all of these other things, the impact of what causes us to go down that slippery slope of poor health, poor mobility, then cognitive decline, depression, those things are all woven together. So these types of issues or strategies are really what is being shown to keep us on that quality path of aging, not just quantity. I think the other pieces just to look at certainly should get mentioned, things like meditation, spirituality. There's proof that connection to a higher, something outside of yourself, whatever that means to you. Sleep and sleep habits, very important. It's time when our brain is reconnecting the synapses. And again, positive outlook and gratitude. Don't underestimate being grateful for what is working, not just what isn't. So I think all of those things are really, you've found my soapbox, so, I could go on, but I would say all of those things and more, really looking at what's meaningful to you and how do you make those years quality.
Thanks. That's really a big help. We're now going to have an audience opportunity for you to ask questions of the panel. But we have one question. Somebody cut in line and submitted a question already, so we'll start with that while you can think of questions. This one's for Kate. Kate, could you comment on organizations that are trying to help the elderly stay in place? Organizations that help put together activities and arrangements to get jobs completed around the house?
Sure. The first thing that came to mind when I read that was the Village movement. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but Beacon Hill Village was one of the first. But now there's a national movement of village groups. And, these are typically organizations or a group in a community, sort of organically formed with some membership typically. And then in that community, they offer things like help with finding household, people to do household chores, a reduction in cost for home care, and any number of things. They really, they're very powerful in helping people connect, ways to volunteer, and so that's an easy sort of, you can look at the village movement, and there's a village map. It's, all over the country, and I think in other parts of the world as well now. So I think it's important to know that kind of sort of organization exists. There's also continuing care retirement groups who have waiting lists, who are now moving into doing, North Hill at Home, and they'll bring some of the services for a fee into your home so you can remain there and meet some of those needs locally. I would tell you, though, given what we've just talked about tonight, you don't need to necessarily prescribe to any one organization. I think you can put together your own unique package of getting these services met, finding resources, care managers. Again, there's all across the country, people do what we do here in the Boston area, that are skilled in finding vetted resources, helping protect because they know and have used the resources and are not just, you're not getting them from the internet or the yellow pages, right? You're more likely to have quality services and coordinate that care in a way that allows people to meet all of the goals and more.
Great. Are there any other questions out there? Here's Estelle's coming with a microphone.
Everyone has different priorities around what quality of life means and what's important for their personal wellness. What is the best way to discuss this issue with family members? How do elder family members have that conversation to say, what's important to me?
In our experience, and talking about primarily financial issues, but I think it applies to the wellness issues that you're talking about, what we see is each family has its own style of communication. And so it's very hard for us to say, and we shouldn't just say to a family, you should communicate this way. Instead, we should be attuned to how they communicate and then work with that to try to get whatever communication that could be effective to take place. And I think the same thing applies to the wellness area. And a real source of help is if there's somebody in the person's circle, be it an advisor or a friend, who's sensitive to the issue, whose word they trust. That'll be the most effective at sort of convincing them to sort of step up and talk about it. And so it's not sort of a one-size-fits-all answer, but I think it's important that among their advisors, just you asking the question is helpful for us. It's something for us to be aware of, because we're in a situation frequently where our clients come to us a lot of times, as the first person if they're having an emergency. So they might be receptive to us talking about that with them or other advisors. Yeah.
I guess I would suggest is it's okay to acknowledge the fact that it's an uncomfortable conversation to start. It's uncomfortable for everybody, but it's so important that, get that on the table and then try to get where you can go. And I think you can go farther if you're willing to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of tools. Atul Gawande is fabulous, and his book is one of those things that I think starts people having different kinds of conversations. And there are others. The Conversation Project, Honoring Choices is a wonderful website. And it really doesn't matter where you do that. Even those of you in the room tonight, we tell families, or when I'm speaking to people about this, you can go home. You now have something to talk about. You can go home and say, hey, I saw this, panel discussion, and it really got me thinking. And you might say to a family member, we're going to really be looking at some of these things. It made me realize we need to talk more. I would also suggest one really important thing. Don't save it for the Thanksgiving table or, way to ruin a meal really, really quickly. One of the things I say to families often is start slow and speak often. Mm-hmm. Don't feel like you have to get it all solved in that moment. Just saying it's an uncomfortable topic. Can we commit to having it occasionally so that we can get on the same page and I can honor you and you can honor me? Sometimes that's all it takes. And then you begin, the quickest way to get a door slammed and never get it opened again is to just go at it, expecting you're going to get. We as daughters and sons are going to get down that checklist while we're visiting mom and dad, filling the pillbox and, doing 10 other things. Not really the best time, So that would be my advice.
Any other questions out there?
People seem to be increasingly moving into retirement communities, many of which require upfront investments to enter. Which factors should someone consider in making such a decision versus staying in your existing home?
Financially, I think you just have to run some numbers. Is it feasible for you? How does it look doing it this way versus that way? What's plan A? What's plan B? Because you may not know, depending on whether you're wanting to live at home may not be the option that works. Investing somewhere, you want to make sure they have the different levels of care and different options. And what's the cost look like? Some places the costs are very flat on the monthly fee forever, and some places they really accelerate quickly. So it's really about gathering information, looking at your circumstances, and then running the numbers.
Yeah, and just from a practical point of view, I think a lot of people are considering the continuing care retirement communities, which is what they're often termed, because you can enter well and independent for the most part, and that's actually a requirement in many of them. And you can age in place through their community or through their continuum at a relative, there's a variety of models, but I think back to the things I talked about earlier, which is what's important to you, because while that is a phenomenal option for many, many people, it's also not the option at all for many. And as you begin to look at how do I feel about living in that kind of a community? Am I social? Is this kind of, what's important to me? All those considerations can help you weigh, along with the financial aspects, and looking at all of those pieces together can help you, I think, weigh this as an option for you. There are many out there. We, as a practice, went to every single one in this last year and asked them an extensive amount of questions about their practices and who they allow in, and what happens when two spouses are at different levels of care, and what's the investment. What happens if you need to bring care into your home? When are you asked to move along the continuum? Those are all questions you need to know before you commit to that investment financially. So there's a lot of homework to be done when you're looking at those as options, but they really fit the needs of many, many people.
I see that we're out of time. Now I'd like to turn it over to Todd Eckler. Todd is our Chief Marketing Officer at Fiduciary Trust.
This is clearly a topic of great importance to many of us and really all of us in the room. I hope you take away with you some guidance that helps you with your own planning or helps you guide loved ones in their planning for elder years. And I also encourage you to continue the dialogue with your fiduciary trust officer or other resources who can help you. We're also, to help continue providing guidance on this front, we are releasing the second part of our elder care series article, which is about the financial and estate planning aspects of elder care. It's bundled together with the first part in our series we released a few months ago, and that'll be available when you leave this evening. And thanks again for coming this evening.